is certainly first in importance when we think about usability. We think about the editor being the user who needs to have a more usable experience. It should always be a high priority, maybe even a top priority, because the people who are working with your content, you want them to be enabled. You want to make sure that they can do what they need to do efficiently and effectively. So we need our content models to be intuitive. And so oftentimes it's like if we're mapping a real world kind of a thing, it needs to make real world sense to the people who are using it. And there's always an intuitive way, even just the order of fields in a model that you set up. It doesn't necessarily make sense to have one field in front of another, but you can easily tweak that and change that based on what makes sense to your users, or just organizing them or choosing the right data types, things like that. Do we need a rich text field versus a long text field that doesn't allow HTML? Things like that. All of this stuff kind of builds together. How is content related to each other? That should make sense. And one of the ways you can help it to make sense to your users is get them involved in the process early. So if you have folks that are going to work on this content, their level of technical experience, their what they're used to is really important. How you name things, probably one of the hardest things to do is just name something in a way that makes sense. Should we call it name? Should we call it title? Should we call it something else? All of that stuff really goes into making a good intuitive content model that will live past often the decisions that you're making. So you're setting yourself up for the future. So it's worth putting a lot of effort into this. And then having easy workflows. Workflow is never easy unless you think about it first. If you just kind of imply it upon and force it upon a system, it won't make sense, and people will give everyone the administrator role and no one will use it. So the workflow needs to make sense within your organization. If you have an 8-step, 22-person workflow thing, then okay, let's look at how we can make sure that things are going to go through that process. And a great question, Sahil. How early should they be involved in the process? I think it should be. I'm going to click the answer live button on here. I'm answering it live. Cool. They should be involved from day one. That should be part of the, hey, what content is important to our organization? How do we name the fields? What order should we name them? That definitely should be something where they are involved, and then they should be re-involved throughout each step. I think we talk about iteration as an important process. Just ask people, hey, does this make sense to you? Do we need to have more documentation in here? Do we need more little info bubbles, more explanation of what a field means, that kind of thing? Certainly that's, you can't get people involved too early.
Yeah, we do talk about that a little later on, in terms of how you kind of get started with these things. It's a big difference on who that person is too. Do they have development experience? Are they, do they know HTML? Do they only know the fields? Are they an intern that alternates through and all the time? So these are great questions to ask. And the only thing I'll add on to the editing experience part, which kind of ties into the content models, but more into how they're kind of displayed. And I know, Joel, you talked about this, where you can have like comments or information or helpers, but like validation. Validation is huge. Like, people would throw fields together and just throw their content model out there, and you'd be like, the fields are there, but there's no validation or something. And it's like, oh, if I don't include a field, but it's required for whatever reason, your whole model falls apart, right? So model isn't just fields. It's validation, it's helpers, it's the experience that editor has. I know you mentioned linking content with IDs for products in an e-commerce system. If you have to type in the ID into your content model for a field like this is related to product ID 52 or SKU 123, it's not as nice as if you have a nice little selector where you can type in the name of the product, you pick the name of the product, and it saves the SKU in behind or ID in behind. So that experience can change everything. So it really is something you got to consider early. And as we get into like how to get started, we'll talk a little bit about when to get the content editors specifically involved.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a good test of the editing experience is like, new person joins the team, and then you sort of, add their login to the system. Can they, what's their feedback when they first start using it? That's always really important, something to look at. Now let's just take a little bit higher level view of workflow and what we talk about when we say the word workflow. There's a few other sort of people that get involved that we might not talk about enough. So the first and foremost, we're talking about editors. Obviously, if it's an editor workflow, those people that are actually creating and editing content are super important, and they are the first ones we should consider. Absolutely. And they are often a different group from the publishers, but not always. In fact, it's actually probably 50-50 for systems where they're set up where it's like you have a very small team sometimes, and your editors are your publishers. But oftentimes we like to think of them as like you're wearing two different hats. So in one hat, you're creating and editing content. In the other hat, you're deciding, yep, it's ready to go on the website. Or nope, this one has to go back because it's not good.
Or even where it goes, right? Where it goes, yes. When it goes,
all of that stuff. So, and I think that's fairly straightforward in terms of like one is a content creation portion of it, and the other is actual workflow where now the content has been created, it's edited, and we're going to improve, decline, whatever, publish that content to get it out there, preview it to make sure it's all good, that kind of thing. But then invariably, there's some sort of external pressure or process that gets put upon you. And I refer to that as the business. What does the business say about this? And that is usually, I can consider the other areas of your organization that have some impact on your work. Now, sometimes the business needs to approve things before it goes out the door. And sometimes they don't even have access to your content platform. They might not even care about it, but they might have some sort of rule that you have to follow through. So that is something to take into account as well. And I think this comes up almost always, right, John? It's often like the hidden in the background kind of thing, right?
Yeah, it's the part that I don't want to say breaks the workflows, but if it's not considered early enough, it's like, oh, this is really hard to do actually. How do I get them to see this? Or how do I integrate this system in the other system and show my content and get full approval? Or the other way, what if we have to move stuff backwards quickly, or something happened and we have to, unpublish things because the business was like, this has to change, or, COVID came. Oh my goodness, we have to change how we do this. That has to ripple all the way back to the editors and publishers to make different changes and things, and that can really shake things up. You could
absolutely. Say. And then finally, and now it's the last in our diagram. It's often the first user that is considered is the end user. And absolutely, the end user is super important, right? This is what the whole point is. We want our end users to experience the content. They're going to see it on the front end, and we need to make sure that it's the right content for them. But there are a lot of pieces that have to work well for that end user to have a good experience and for them to get consistently good content in the kind of rhythm that we know marketing teams need to have. The content is updated often, and not just often, but it's like as part of an iteration, as part of these sort of business processes that are set up. So this is the kind of the flow that we see in terms of who the people are that are working with content.
Yeah. And to be honest, if you go back maybe 10, 20 years ago, this diagram probably would have been exactly the opposite way. Mm-hmm. You would start with the end users and like, what do they want to see? And what is the business objectives? What do they get out? And think about how you publish it. And then the last thing would be like, can the editors do their job, or do they need to do something? Yeah. So, from our standpoint, especially Joel and I, he said next year's his 18 year. And the entire time we've been talking about content architecture, usability, how do we make it easy for the editors? It's music to our ears that the industry is shifting this model. Well, again, we'll talk about it a little later, but like if the editors can't do their job, nothing will get to the end users, right? So there's a pretty heavy dependence to create a great customer experience on that editor's job and how they can do their work. And also every stage along the way for publishers in the business as well.
Not only can they do their job, they should like it. I think they should have an enjoyable experience. That's my belief. And so that's what we work towards.
Yeah.